So Richard in Walthamstow has a question, which I think you've kind of started talking about, which is around could a reformed immigration policy support wage growth in care work or other low-skill service jobs?
Well, I mean, I think care work is a good example, and that's one area where you can imagine that we don't pay care workers very much. Mm-hmm. One of the results is that you've had because British people consequently aren't that often unwilling to join it, that you've had quite a large influx first of people from outside the EU, and then until the rules were tightened up, and then people from within the EU. But there's a problem here. The salaries for care workers come mostly from the public purse, one way or another. They come either directly from public subsidy or from people being paid for their care stays, or indirectly because there's some form of public subsidy. So what's really holding back wages in care work isn't immigration. Immigration is just a symptom here. What's holding back wages in care work is that we've underfunded the care sector for the last 20 years, but especially for the last 7 years when there have been huge cuts. So if you think that after Brexit, the government suddenly discover a huge pot of money that it wants to spend on care, then you can raise wages, and then maybe you'll have British people doing these jobs. If, on the other hand, more likely you don't, and the government continues to underfund the sector, then you'll simply have what you already have, which is staff shortages and poor standards of care. And the idea that restricting on immigration on its own will sort of magically make new money appear to raise wages and attract British workers into the sector, there's really very little reason to think that that's going to happen. And remember, of course, that the wider economic impacts of Brexit will probably mean the government has somewhat less money to spend overall, not more money to spend overall. So that makes it even less plausible that you're going to get the influx of money that the care sector needs. I mean, the care sector, I do think this is one area where I am less sort of think that the positive benefits of immigration are less obvious, in the sense that I do think it would be better if the government funded the care sector properly, and that might indeed lead to less immigration. But it hasn't happened. In fact, things have got worse, not better, over the last few years, and I'm not particularly optimistic things are going to get better over the next few years.
And that's one of the conclusions in the MAC report as well,
yes.
right? Like the problem in the social care sector is more about funding as opposed to immigration.
And I think, frankly, I think the MAC, this is the Migration Advisory Committee, which advises the government on migration issues. The MAC were a bit naive, frankly, to think that, we can just tell the government to spend more money on care and that will solve the problem, because the government may listen to the MAC on migration policy, but it's not going to listen to the MAC when it tells them to spend a few billion quid extra and put up taxes to pay for it.
It's all quite complicated, isn't it? So sticking with this for a moment, is there any way a new immigration policy could support higher wages for British workers on low-skilled jobs?
Well, you can imagine it might in some subsectors that wages might rise for some people if there are areas where there are particularly large numbers of low-skilled workers. But we haven't seen much evidence of it so far. So, for example, in the 2 years before the referendum, we had record levels of EU migration, the highest levels of migration overall, and especially of European migration ever. And wages were actually going quite well just before the referendum. We had wage growth of more than 3% total, real wage growth, in the 2 years before the referendum, which was the highest we've had since the financial crisis. So that back to sort of average by historical standards. Not great, but at least average, which is the best we've done since the crisis. In the 2 years since the referendum, immigration from the EU has fallen. But while you do hear this sort of anecdotal talk about wages being driven up in some areas by skill shortages, overall, you look at the data, and actually wage growth performance since the referendum has been terrible. Immigration has fallen, but wages haven't responded. In fact, wages have only grown by about 1% or so in the 2 years since the referendum, so much lower than they did before the referendum, even though immigration has fallen. So that doesn't mean that in some areas that some people may not have benefited, but overall we can say that so far you haven't seen these big positive effects. And I think more fundamentally, the thing to remember is that ultimately wage growth comes from productivity. And you have to increase your productivity if you want to pay yourself more as a country. Right. And it's not at all obvious, and indeed the evidence is the other way as to where, that reducing immigration will somehow magically make productivity increase faster. We haven't seen any evidence of that so far.
Can I ask a follow-up question with my non-economist hat on, which is how do economists define productivity? What does that mean?
It just means how much you can produce. It literally is as simple as that. Now you can have different measures of productivity. So you can have labor productivity, which is how much per worker. You can have how much per worker hour. How much does, and that's sort of typically the way we tend to think about it in the UK. There are other measures which I won't explain, but if you sort of productivity for the economy as a whole, how much is the average? What is the value of the output produced by the average worker in an hour? Right. That is a sort of a short version of it.
And is that measured in pounds?
Pounds.
Yeah.
Pounds.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool.